Hey everybody, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro live streaming as always on Tuesday on A Mighty Blaze. I'm here with Eric Puchner. How did I not ask you this in the green room? Is it
It's
Puchner or
very
Puchner?
difficult. Everyone gets it wrong, but it's Puck like a book. So Puchner.
Puchner.
Yeah.
Thank you. There we go. So Eric Puchner, who is the recent Oprah Book Club pick, his novel Dream State, which is somewhere on my desk, is right here. It is a beautiful novel that really got me. And here's what I want to tell you. I don't like it when a book is doing wonderful magical things and I sort of don't know why. And so I spent a long time reading this book, both enjoying it and also figuring out like how the magic works. And I have a lot of thoughts about how you created this very particular wonderful magical spell in this book. And that will be the subject of the next hour of conversation. But first, as you know, Thoughtful Bro streams every Tuesday at 2 on A Mighty Blaze, talking about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. We're never asking for money on A Mighty Blaze. If you want to show the love, just tell your friends about us, repost us, retweet us, all the things. If you are in the mood to spend money, please spend it on deeply moving family epics about families that fall apart and come back together and sort of work through their troubles over many, many decades. Books like Dream State by Eric Puchner. We'll put a link to buy that book in the chat at Eric's favorite local indie bookstore, I think which is called Ivy Books. Regarding questions, just pop them in the comments. If we have time to get to them at the end, we will. Now for a little bit more about Eric. He is the author of the novel Model Home, which was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award and the winner of the California Book Award. He also has written 2 collections of short stories, Last Day on Earth and Music Through the Floor, the latter of which was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lion Award. His fiction and personal essays have appeared in GQ, Granta, McSweeney's, Tin House, the Best American Non-Required Reading, and the Best American Short Stories. He received the Wallace Stegner Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Arts grant. He also won an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is an associate professor and head of the creative writing department, I believe, at Johns Hopkins University. His latest book, as I said, Dream State, was just announced as an Oprah Book Club pick. Oprah's got some great Instagram content. Don't go there now. Go there after the interview. But she's got a great interview with Eric up there and some fun excerpts from the book. It's a story about 50 years. It's set in a house in Montana, a rapidly changing Montana, I should say. It explores marriage, betrayal, friendship, addiction, old age, Alzheimer's, climate change, and more. People magazine said it is already one of this year's best. And the great Ron Charles, writing in the Washington Post, wrote, quote, "It is a family history that feels monumental." I agree. Eric, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I am so happy too. And just for those who are watching live, I am going to be turning my head off screen because my printer went on the fritz moments before we went live. So I could not print out my questions. So I'm just going to be looking a little bit off to the right. But as I said, this book just worked in this mysterious way for me. I think there is real magic in this book. I think the reason why people go to books is for the magic. People go to books because they're able to create a feeling that cannot be created by any other means than the novel. And I think that is what has happened here, at least for this humble reader. So we're just going to spend the next hour kind of talking about the different ways that you did this wonderful world-class magic trick, which is Dream State. But for those who haven't read it yet, it's only been out a week. Give us a little thumbnail for what the book is about.
Sure. The book focuses on a house in Montana, a beloved lake house in Montana, and it spans over 50 years in the lives of 2 male friends and the woman they both love. And it traces how a stunning betrayal goes on to impact not just the friends themselves, all 3 of them, all 3 of their lives, but also their children. So I could talk about the themes, but maybe I'll save that for later.
Yeah, it's just, I think what you just did there with a book that's like so huge and covers so much, just shorter is better because you can't possibly begin to sum up everything this book is about. But I will say that, like, I think the inspiration from the book was a little girl puking during a wedding. Is that fair?
That's true. Yeah, I don't know if I trace it back to that particular little girl or not. Not my own girl, but somebody else's. But when I was thinking about this book, I wanted to write about this place that is really near and dear to my heart, which is this place in northwestern Montana, which is in my wife's family and was built by my wife's great-grandfather. at the turn of the 20th century. He was a Lithuanian immigrant who came over to Montana, lived in Glasgow, Montana for a little while, was completely destitute, lived in a packing crate because he had no money at all. And the only way he survived the winter was that when the train went through town, they would throw coal to him so he could burn it. And anyway, he ended up becoming kind of a self-made middle-class man. He built a dry goods store in the back of a saloon, and eventually ended up building this house on Flathead Lake. It's a somewhat humble house. The guy who built it apparently was a total drunk, and it took him multiple years, and there's not a right angle in the entire house. Anytime a contractor comes, it's like, who the hell built this house? What's wrong with it? But my wife and I have been going there for 25 years, and once we had kids, bringing the family. So it's a huge part of our summers, and I'm madly in love with the landscape.
I love how you describe the house too. I feel like everybody's got that house kind of in their past. It's like the house that's got that, like all the furniture smells like smoke, and all like the board games are like stacked on that random shelf. And like right. you think you're never going to use one of them. Then one rainy day, you just pull out Parcheesi. Let's talk about like sort of the heart of this story. I mean, I think to me, the book, it's an old-fashioned novel. And let me just qualify that before you react. I just think there's something so classic, so sturdy about it. I mean, it's about a love triangle. It's about a massive betrayal. Kirkus, in its review, said this is a novel that feels both old-fashioned and bracingly inventive. So, but I just feel like in the day we live in today, you tell somebody they wrote a kind of classic old-fashioned novel, and it feels like a deeply backhanded compliment. And I'm just wondering, do you feel that way? Because I don't mean it that way. I mean it.
Oh, no, I know you don't. Yeah, thank you. I take it as a compliment, honestly. And I do feel like the latter half of the novel is doing something, I don't know. I mean, bracingly inventive is an awful nice thing to say, but I definitely was trying to do something different. I was trying to play with the classic marriage plot. And I'm really interested in novels in which the antagonist is time. I'm kind of obsessed with that as a theme. I knew it was going to be a big book. I wanted it to cover 50 years, but I wanted the first, 150 pages or so to feel like a classic Russian novel, honestly. Yeah. I mean, that's what I was going for. And then I wanted to try to deconstruct that kind of novel in the second half. So, I mean, it's so hard to talk about what a book is actually about, because as you were saying earlier, I think quite well, a novel is about the experience of reading it. It's about the emotional experience you have while reading it. It's about the aesthetic experience of reading it, right? So it's really impossible to say what a book is about, but I was going for a particular feeling. And for whatever reason, that feeling meant writing the first section in a fairly traditional mode, and then doing something quite different for the second 2/3 of the book. And sort of eliding a lot that happened and covering many years and jumping ahead in time and so on.
Yeah. There's a great quote from Tolstoy, which I'm sure I've told this so many times. I'm sure it's apocryphal by now, but somebody once asked him, like, what is the meaning of Anna Karenina, or what is Anna Karenina about? And he said, for me to answer that question, I'd have to write Anna Karenina again. And like, I mean, that's sort of it, right? I mean, it's like, if it could have been said another way, it would have been said that way. As I think about this huge moment in the story, I mean, it comes in the first kind of 60, 70 pages, and it is this friendship betrayal, and it's related to this love triangle. I had, probably like any reader would have, very strong feelings about kind of what was right and wrong, and how I would have reacted. It's just it's about as big a life moment as one can imagine, certainly for these three characters. I'm just wondering, I'm sure I have a feeling what the answer might be, but I sort of want to hear how you answer it. Do you have a feeling? Did you side with one of the characters? Do you have like a kind of almost moral ranking of them in your head, and like one is sort of harder to take and one you're more sympathetic towards? Or is it more a kind of like, to understand all is to forgive all kind of approach to these characters?
I hope the latter. I mean, I really don't take sides. And I mean, one of the themes of the book has to do with regret and these sort of ghost lives, the lives that we've chosen not to lead, that go on to sort of haunt all three of these characters. In fact, all five of them, the two kids as well. And so, one character ends up with another character, could have very easily, in fact, was intended to be with a different character. And yet, either of those lives that she chose, she might have been equally happy and unhappy. And that's sort of one of the points of the book. And so I certainly don't try to judge my characters on ethical grounds. I think that's just a mistake as a novelist. And, as a novelist, I'm drawn to suffering and I'm drawn to mistakes. And that, only trouble is interesting. And I think I would never rank them in that particular way that you described.
No, and certainly the book doesn't. And the book sort of poses the question well, as they say. I think it's actually one of the strongest aspects of the book that not only does the book not come down on anyone's side and just kind of seeks to explore to the fullest extent possible kind of all sides of this problem, but I think that one of the great things about the book, and the psychology in this book is so wonderful, and I want to talk about that in a moment, but there's a way that the characters themselves don't know what the right choice was. And I sort of, and sometimes they sort of think that they do, and then sometimes they don't. I mean, here's some ways that this one character described that critical betrayal: the mad spasm of an animal, a dark, aching madness. I mean, even to these characters, even 10 years, 20 years on, they sort of don't know why they did what they did, but it was kind of an irresistible thing that they were following. And I just wonder, what your thoughts are on that just generally in life. Because this is sort of the psychological truth of the big choices that we make in life forever, evasive.
They might be. We're pretty inscrutable creatures, human beings. It's hard to know why we do things. And one of the wonderful things about fiction for me is that you often have characters, and I think almost all good fiction does this. You have characters who purport to want one thing. They think they want one thing. It's not even they're purporting. They're not lying. They don't know that they're lying to themselves. They think they want something. And we know as a reader often that's not what they actually want, and it's certainly not what they should want, right? And so I was interested in that. I'm really interested in that sort of gulf between the private and public self, this sort of whatever we project to others and how that's interpreted and who we actually are inside. And sometimes we just don't know who we are inside because so much of our lives are spent performing for others. That's a big theme in the book. I mean, so the character of Cece, there's an anecdote that goes on to play kind of a large role in the book, which has to do with her father asked her what her favorite animal was. And she said a raccoon because she loved raccoons when she was a little girl. And he misunderstood her and thought she said baboon. And so he ends up getting her a big stuffed baboon the size of an armchair for her birthday or something. And she doesn't have the heart because she's getting so much positive affirmation about the baboon stuff, she doesn't have the heart to tell him, no, I don't like baboons, I like raccoons. And so she ends up just adopting that. And she, gets posters of baboons all over her room and goes through her early childhood saying she loves baboons to everybody. And the whole time it's a lie because she, if he'd heard something else, she would have put different posters up on them. And similarly, she decides that she wants to be a pediatric neurosurgeon because she falls in love with the words pediatric neurosurgeon as a girl. And she's getting all this affirmation from the adults like, oh, look at my precocious young girl. She wants to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. And so she goes to med school. I mean, it changes the course of her entire life and she hates it. She's miserable.
Yeah.
She, even in college when she was pre-med, hated biochem, whatever. So she has to drop out. So the stuff that we purport to want on the outside may not be what we actually want on the inside.
It reminds me of the story of one of my good friends once told me he lived in New York City and there was this bagel truck near where he worked. And so one day he goes to this, he's in high school he must have been, he grew up in New York. Maybe it was in high school. I mean, I think he was younger So it was like maybe next to his school or something. So he goes up to this bagel truck, and this guy like gives him like an extra piece of like salmon on his bagel. And he's like, hey, just for you. Like for some reason, he treated them in this like extra special way. And he said, thank you. But like the thing was, he like hated it. Like he didn't want that much salmon. But then every day when he showed up again, the guy always put extra salmon on. He's like, hey, I'm going to get you again. Like, and that guy thought he had a special thing, but my friend always took the salmon off. And it's just, I don't know, it's just one of those kinds of stories where people get trapped in some relationship and they're afraid to get out of it.
You get trapped in a role and you spend the rest of your life, performing that role.
That's right. That's right.
To please somebody else. Yeah.
That's right. It seemed like such an Eric Puchner moment to me just now. All right. So one of the things, when I say this is a classic and traditional novel, to the extent that it is, I think it does well some of the things that great novels do well. And I think one of the great strengths of the novel, above other media, is the ability to create psychological realism and like kind of penetrating psychological insight that kind of shows the difference between the inner and the outer. And this is something that is on every page of this book. And sometimes I argue with writer friends about sentence level writing, quote unquote. I'm a big kind of story person, and kind of like, what is the arc of the story and what does that say about the character? Like a lot of the emotional freight that I get out of a novel is about story arcs and how people change or don't change over time. And so the sentence level isn't as important to me insofar as it's not serving that end. But I think your sentence level stuff to me is like the best kind, because it's not actually about language, which is often kind of what people are talking about. It's not about language per se. I think that like the way that you find like the mot juste, so to speak, is like the most psychologically penetrating language, like the right word for you. This is a big fat compliment I'm giving you, so I'm just taking a long time here. But it's the way that like just a little tiny turn of phrase, like you talked about one character, I remember he was feeling like very happy with and full of anticipation, and his heart filled up like a sail filling up with wind. I mean, yes, it's beautiful, but it's better because it's actually saying something that I totally understand. It's like carrying the emotion and the psychology. So I just thought that was everywhere in this work. And I think like one of the things that you do really well is like around like facial expressions, tone of voice, gestures, that sort of like inadvertently communicate something that the person is hiding or doesn't want to communicate or didn't think they wanted to communicate. And I guess I just want to put all of that back to you and just kind of ask you about that. I heard you say in an interview once, you said, real world building is, I'm paraphrasing, but real world building isn't about kind of creating dragons and magic spells and, currencies of future worlds. Real world building is creating like real human complexity and psychological complexity. And I just thought that was like A++ in this work. And so the question to you is just kind of about this and how important psychological realism is to you.
Well, thank you for saying that about the language. I obviously I'm a writer, so I'm enamored with language and I'm enamored with sentences at the same time that I don't want them to show off and do a little dance for the reader. I'm not interested in them like, pulling up their skirt or whatever. So I feel like the larger question about psychological realism, I've been thinking a lot about what people call imaginative writing, and it's partly because I'm a teacher and I see a lot of aspiring young writers who are very interested in what they think is imaginative writing. And so for them, that often translates into fantastical writing. And I don't just mean fantasy as a genre, although I see a fair amount of that with the undergraduates. But I'm talking about, writing that's sort of more blatantly surreal. And I like some of that stuff. And some of my favorite stories are surreal. But I think that it's often mistaken for true imagination. So I don't know why I always like, this is just something I came up with. It's not one of my students, but like, someone will write about a tap dancing bear or something, they'll answer the door and there's a tap dancing bear. And the students will say, oh, that's so imaginative. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I guess it's imaginative, but that's just a dream really. Or you just ate a weed gummy or something. That's great. It's cool, but it's not necessarily what I would define as a product of the imagination. For me, that takes a lot of work, and it takes serious concentration, and it's about getting a fully formed human being on the page. I mean, that's so difficult to do, and that requires true imagination. So the books that I'm drawn to are books with real psychological depth. It's what I care about. And I tried with this book in particular for it to be fairly kind of vertical as opposed to horizontal. I mean, obviously there's plot, and I wanted it to move along, and I wanted to interest people and keep them reading. But what I was really interested in, of course, were the characters themselves and what made them tick.
Vertical. What a great word. I've never even heard that word used to describe the thing you're using to describe it, but that really does capture it. And it's yet another example of psychological precision. So we caught a live version of you being psychologically precise on the show. Another thing you're good at is the big little moment, I will call it. There are a number of moments through the book where it's the heart of the scene. I would say the single biggest moment of the entire book involves a gesture, and I will only say, just so you know what I mean without spoiling anything, it is a gesture that involves a spray can. And that gesture is it's for me the most memorable moment of the book, and it's a wordless gesture, but the entire lifetimes of these three characters sort of circles around and emanates out of that single gesture and what it means. I've seen in your other writing, I read a great essay about your father that I want to spend a minute talking about, but that essay also revolves around a facial expression that your father made one time, and that seemed to kind of define the relationship in a way for the rest of your life. And there's lots of other moments like this where words are not even used. And I just want to ask you about that moment, and sort of from a craft perspective, like, do you think of these like I think that is the psychological moment, or like the gesture or the facial expression that I need to write towards, and then you like write toward that big moment, which is like truly the climax of the scene? Or is it more that it just kind of emerges in the writing?
Definitely the latter. I mean, yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. I am really interested in gesture, and especially gestures that can't be fully explained necessarily.
Yep.
They can be partially explained, but people do weird things all the time, and we don't understand why they're doing them. I am looking for places where the emotional plot in a short story or a novel can rise to the surface and become actual plot. That's what I'm interested in. And those are the kind of electric moments in novels, I think, when the stuff that's been sort of under the surface, kept hidden, rises to the surface and is dramatized. And but I'm not really interested in directly dramatizing something, having people actually talk about what they mean, because we so rarely do that in life. And that also just drains all of the, interesting stuff out of your book and all the tension. So you're looking for oblique ways to dramatize that stuff. And I'm saying all this as if it's like a super conscious decision on my part, but honestly, most of it is intuitive. I'm not thinking consciously about any of it. The gesture that you're talking about comes from Garrett, who at the beginning of the book is a misanthrope working as a baggage handler at the airport. He's a college dropout. He likes animals much more than humans. And he sometimes has these kind of almost psychotic existential episodes where he imagines that people are just so disgusting to him that he can't bear to see them and wants to, like a giant spray bottle to get rid of them. And that comes back later in the book. But especially those moments that where things become not just mentioned once in the book, become patterns in the book. They rhyme with earlier instances. That stuff just is one of those moments in a book when you're writing it where the book becomes smarter than you are. You don't know it's coming, and then it comes, and you're like, oh my God, yeah, where did that come from? And that's to me is what makes writing so wonderful. Those moments in particular.
So I had a woman on the show, Allison Espach. She had a book that was real big this summer called The Wedding People. And that book, tonally is very different from yours. Both very funny books, I should say. But, that book is about, it shares a wedding, but it's about a lot of different things. But, she's a writing teacher like you are. And I like to ask people for writing advice, which I'll do with you a little bit later. But one thing that she said, I said, give me your best piece of writing advice. And she said, have a character in a situation where they're feeling something that they should not be feeling. And then just start unpacking from there. And in her case, it's not a spoiler to say it's a person who's at a wedding who wants to commit suicide. And so that is a very incongruous feeling. And so what's that about and why? And all of a sudden you start having a story, right? Or at least you have a character.
Yeah.
And I just saw so much of that in this book. There's so much of people not only feeling things they shouldn't be feeling, but not knowing how to express it, not knowing why they're feeling it. And I'm just kind of curious what you thought about that particular piece of advice.
I think it's great advice. I mean, yeah, and we go around feeling things we're not supposed to be feeling all the time, don't we? That's called life. And I think we sort of convince ourselves and can try to convince others that we're not feeling those things. It's amazing to me, like, when I teach, because I teach a lot and I teach short stories, and many of my favorite short stories are quite dark. And the students always, sometimes they complain about how dark the short stories are that we're reading, and they seem to be depressed by them. But I actually find that to be invigorating when somebody is sort of telling the truth in that way. And I think part of that truth is that, yes, we do feel things. It doesn't mean we act on them. It doesn't mean we're bad people, but we feel them inside, right? And so if you're going to be a writer, you've got to be as honest as possible about life, or there's really no point. And about human character, there isn't really no point to it. But I'll say another thing about that particular quote that I like. I think that's a great prompt, a piece of advice. I just wrote an essay about literary humor, just about being funny in novels and how you go about doing it for LitHub. And so I've been thinking a lot about it. And I read this great book by Simon Critchley, I think his name is. He's a British philosopher about humor. And he talks about there being a disconnect between expectation and actuality. That's what makes something funny, right? So you expect to sit down and then somebody pulls a chair away from you and you fail to adapt, right? That's sort of what humor is. And I was just thinking about how many of my stories and novels are born from comic moments that occur to me when I'm walking around and make me laugh, at least inside. And so I never finished telling about the wedding, so this is a good way to come back to it. But I was officiating at a wedding. And these poor people who got married, that I've been feeling so guilty about it, because Oprah in particular has really latched onto this story as being the genesis of the novel. And I keep talking about this disastrous wedding and feeling so guilty inside, because these are people that are close to me. And, they both wrote me the other day saying, please don't worry about it, Eric. It's totally fine. I never thought it would be a funny story, but it is now. But anyway, so this was a wedding in which like half the wedding party got norovirus, which is this. It's going around again, but it's this awful sort of virus where, it comes out of both ends, and you're totally fine 1 minute, and the next second you just throw up out of the blue, right? So one of the flower girls at the wedding threw up on her way down the aisle, and the groom was so ill, he was so sick, he had to sit down during his own vows. And so I was just really drawn to that, not because it was necessarily funny, but just because it was such a profound disconnect between how you expect a wedding to go and then how it actually does go. And so I knew that was going to be sort of one of the fulcrums of the book on which it pivots. Like, I knew that after that, everything was going to be different. I didn't really even know how it was going to be different, but I knew that was going to change everything. I didn't know that... well, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but so I knew that was going to be a very important moment in the book, but I actually didn't even know who was going to end up with whom when I began the book. Even as I was writing toward it, I didn't really know. In fact, I think I originally thought the opposite was going to happen. It was just going to be a close call.
Oh, well, it's so great. It's so great. I'm going to avoid gushing and move on to my next question. This essay you wrote in GQ a while back called Schemes of My Father, I thought it was terrific. We'll link to it in the chat. As I mentioned earlier, there's a sort of single facial expression, which is very much at the heart, the emotional heart of that story. And it reminded me a lot of kind of like some of the gesture stuff that we've been talking about in this interview. But, that essay to me was a little bit of a key to understanding this book. There's also there's a wonderful ending. This book has an incredible ending that a lot of people have remarked upon that sort of illuminates and uplifts. I think it's really a remarkable and unexpected touch. It's also that essay and this book are both about kind of families that are dissolving and trying to come back together. I mean, kind of people who can't exit each other's lives no matter what has happened between them. But the biggest thing I saw in that essay about your father, who is this kind of Gatsby-like figure who's kind of trying to change his life entirely and chasing a dream of wealth in California, is that it's about dreamers. And it got me, I mean, one of the things that I was wondering about this whole book is dream state. I mean, I don't think that phrase actually appears in the book. And, I was thinking like, what is this about? Why this focus on dreams that you put it in the title? When I read that essay, it sort of clicked for me. It's a story about people sort of kind of being unable to resist chasing some dream and not quite understanding the dream. And even if the dream is doomed and the dream almost from its inception seems certain to bring ruin, and yet it is chased anyway. It really got me thinking about how you have, I wouldn't say a soft spot, but I would say a keen psychological interest in kind of unpacking people who just relentlessly chase their dreams regardless of consequence. And it just got me thinking like, is it a good thing? We always hear in this country that we need to chase our dreams and make your dreams come true, all of these things. But I think your take on dreams would be far more mixed and certainly more subtle than that. Talk to me about people and their dreams.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think partly the book, the dream state as a title is so complicated in terms of the ways that it's supposed to resonate with the book ideally on lots of different levels, as both a good thing and a bad thing. Partly it's about as you get older and partly, and are dealing with modern life and are being so wedded to our phones and also a warming earth that life has increasingly begun to seem like a dream. There's also the dream of that life that wasn't lived that sort of haunts us. But also I think you're right. It's about sort of like what we want out of life and our dreams for life. And I think we often mistake that dream state, that idea of what we want from life for life itself, which is actually what you're living at the moment. The place from which you're dreaming is life. It's not the dream itself. So I think about that a lot. And there's this great, I think about my poor editor told me I quote too many writers and I shouldn't do that. But I feel that's okay on this podcast to quote writers. But there's this quote that I think about constantly. I love Philip Larkin, the poet, and one of his poems, he talks about fulfillment's desolate attic. And I think about you want something so badly and then you get it and you get up there and you're in the attic and there's nothing up there. There's another attic above that. There's always another attic above the attic. They did this whole study on like professors who get tenure. And they work so hard to get tenure, and it's their entire life. It's like, as soon as I get tenure, I'll be a made man and I can relax. And then they get tenure and it's like, there's nothing up here. So I think you can easily fall into that trap. It's like, needing to buy the next iPhone whenever it comes out. It's just, you get it. And then there's the next one coming out in a couple of years. So you just have to, remind yourself that life is what you're doing right now at the very moment. It's not where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years or 50.
I was just having a conversation with a writer friend of mine this morning, and we were talking about this very thing and about how, what is the mix? So let's say somebody thinks I'm in a good mood today. I'm happy. Let's just use that word. And we were trying to say, what is the mix between the present and the expectation of the future in that moment of happiness? Is it 20%? I feel I just ate a good meal. I just exercised. I feel healthy today. It's night. It's 50 degrees outside instead of 30. Okay. That's part of the moment. But also it's I know this thing is coming. I know I patched up my relationship with this person who I'm going to see next week. So I'm looking forward to that meeting. I just think it's sort of an interesting question. I'm building off of you saying the happiness is about the thing in the moment rather than the dream. And I just think it's interesting to think how much of present happiness is borrowed from the dream to be fulfilled.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting point. We could probably have a whole philosophical discussion about time. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in the book, particularly in the second half of the book, is have people be surprised by time's passing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's so interesting to me that, I mean, the fact that time passes and that life is evanescent, it's passing, it's going to disappear, is both the source of what's beautiful about life and also the source of what's tragic about life. And so one of the reasons that the chapters in the second half sort of skip ahead in time in a surprising way is that I wanted to surprise both the characters and the reader with the fact that time has passed in the way that I feel more and more as I get older, that I'm just surprised. Oh my God, 10 years, really? We've been in Baltimore for 11 years. I just moved here. There's something that happens in the second half of our lives. And actually my birthday's in a couple of days and I'm in my 50s. And there's something weird that happens there. It's so disproportionate, our sense of time. When we're young, right, it feels like 100 years. Those first 20 years feel like 100. And then time gets more and more compressed, where suddenly the second half feels like a few years. It's a fascinating, disturbing, interesting phenomenon.
I'm going to go out on a limb here because I'm going to botch this because it's sort of mathematical and I'm not good at math. But a friend once explained to me that principle. He said that time passes at a rate which is equal to what percent of your life that year was. So if you're 2 years old, the last year will seem like half your life. Like it passes that slowly. But if you're, say, 50, every year is like, whatever it is, 1/50th of your life, right? And so it will feel that it's going at, whatever, like 25 times the rate of a year that is lived between 1 and 2. Do you see what I'm saying?
I didn't know there was an algorithm for that. I should have figured. Yeah, that's great. I've never heard that before. That's fine.
But I don't know if it's totally accurate, but it's an interesting thing to think about. I want to go to something else. I want to talk about the Russians. Big topic, but we're going to cover it as quickly as we can here. There's Russian novelists all over this book. I love the Russians. Tolstoy is maybe my favorite author, but I mean, when you talk about Turgenev and Chekhov, and there's a lot of Russians who are quoted in this book. Anna Karenina is brought up again and again, and I think as a kind of touchstone, as a book about an affair. And a betrayal. I think it's a great touchstone, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I just kind of want to list some of the things that I think of when I think of the big Russians and what I see here. So number one, psychological realism is sort of like the name of the game. I think that is something that the Russians are known for. I think that's something that is going on here as like a preeminent concern. I think there's a lot of like not like tedious or drawn out, but just big moral and not moral, kind of pondering about like life and death, like sort of like, what does life mean? Am I living the right life? Like, what have I done with my life? This kind of stuff strikes me as very Russian. And this is all in the best way. I mean, I love this kind of stuff. And I did think, we brought up morality before, and you said you don't want to be moral as an artist, but I think there is a lot of morality in this book. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of conscience. There's characters who care and are about whether they've done something right or wrong, or worry. They feel guilt. Okay. And that this idea of like conscience being at center stage and like kind of, has the score ever been settled for that old betrayal, is like as a kind of preoccupation worthy of a lifetime of thought. That seems Russian. And there's also suffering. I mean, there's somebody who like considers killing themselves over someone they love. I mean, that's Vronsky, right? And I guess I wanted to, I'm going to go a little bit further. I know I've been rambling here, but I wanted to go a little bit further and just kind of like read just a couple quick passages that I thought were just so beautiful and also so very Russian. So this one is about love. And this is Cece, the main female character, saying, "She'd thought true love was about being understood. But what if it was better to be misunderstood? What if love wasn't about sharing yourself completely, about yoking your secret sorrow to another's, but about finding someone who made you forget yourself?" Just wonderful kind of philosophical thinking about love. There's another one about Cece, the same character, thinking about life and like, had she really lived life? I mean, this is like straight out of a Chekhov play. She'd gone on a hike once with her husband, Garrett, some unmarked route he'd found on a satellite map. Hidden Meadow, it was nicknamed, and they'd wandered on the trail for hours searching for their destination. Life seemed like that hike to her sometimes, forever peering through the trees, waiting for the glimpse of the flowers. Where was it? Where? She was beginning to expect that it didn't exist. And then just one last sentence I'll read. And again, just worthy of Chekhov. Neither of them deserved their fate, and yet this is what life had dealt them. The amount of kind of beautiful, clear is a great word for this writing too, clear emotion and psychology in those passages. It's so wonderful in its own right, but it also just seems to come out of this wonderful Russian tradition of writing. And so I just wanted to put that back to you and get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I adore the Russians as well. Wow, worthy of Chekhov. Can I put that on my paperback?
Oh, yeah. From Mark Cecil, the thoughtful bro. Put it on the cover.
Yeah, wow, that's great. I mean, I love those Russian novels. They are my favorite novels. Anna Karenina is probably my favorite book. And just the way that they capture, I mean, Dostoevsky as well in a very different way, the way that, and Chekhov, one of my all-time favorite writers. So the way that they capture the vicissitudes of human emotion, the ups and downs, just put everything on the page. And that's what I am missing, honestly, from a lot of contemporary literature, I have to say. I pick up a book and I think it's like the voice is great. It's super funny. It's original. I'm drawn in. And then the main character, the protagonist, starts acting like an alien. I just don't even understand them on an emotional level. And it throws me out of the book. Like, no one would do that. There isn't a person on earth, well, maybe a couple, and they're psychopaths. So that would behave that way. So I'm looking for recognizable humans. They don't have to be likable, right? I don't care about that. I just want to recognize them as being a human being. And so that speaks to your mentioning, the morality of the book and people having consciences and feeling guilty about their choices. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't feel guilty about some of the things that they've done in life. And in some cases are really haunted by that guilt. It's part of the human experience. So I don't think the book, I try to avoid having sort of a moral lesson in my books, but so does Tolstoy and so does Chekhov. That doesn't mean they don't write about morality, right? And so I'm very interested in that as a theme, but mostly I'm just interested in human beings and trying to capture the full breadth of human experience on the page. So.
I just want to build on one thing you said about the morality, because I'm very interested in that too. And I just feel like having a moral dimension to one's personality and having, one's morals take up enormous psychological real estate. That's something that I think about for myself. And I think it's something that's out of fashion. And I'm curious if you feel that way too. I mean, I don't think it's just lack of characterization that causes some of your writing students maybe to write a psychopathic character or some of these contemporary novelists. But I think there is, at the risk of sounding profoundly out of touch and old fashioned, it seems like there's almost a trend and a kind of a sexiness to characters who don't have a moral compass. And that passes for kind of an elevated kind of life, like they've transcended feeling guilty about anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I do want to say that I have a lot of wonderful students.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw your
No, it's not. It's my own fault. But undergrads and grad students, my grad students are brilliant. Yeah. So, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel that as well. I feel like bleakness can become an affectation in the same way that sentimentality can become an affectation. It rings equally false to me. And I do think it is a little trendy to write characters who seem to be psychopaths. But that said, I mean, people have been doing this for years. That's what's so surprising, that people find this original, because go back and read The Stranger. Existential anomie and not having a conscience. I mean, that has been on the one of the settings on the literary table for a very, very long time. So it's surprising to me that people are still interested in that. I'm less interested in that, or less than zero, which was sort of the grandson of The Stranger. And I read a lot of those books when I was a teenager, and I'm just less interested in that as a 54-year-old.
So I want to spend the last part of the conversation here talking about craft, and I always love having people who are teachers of writing on the show and kind of getting some of your best tips, as I did from Allison Esbach over the summer. But first, I want to just talk about first the craft of writing Cece, who is the main character, who has been widely praised as such an incredibly strong character, and she really is the heart of the book, and it feels that she is the person around which the book is truly structured to me. I'm just wondering, how, as a man, did you approach writing that character? Did it just come as second nature and you didn't think twice about it? Was it a lot harder to write a female character than the two main male characters? Talk about writing female characters so well.
Well, thank you for saying that. I've been asked this question a number of times, and I'm always a little bit flummoxed as to how to answer it. I just treat the female characters and the male characters like human beings. And if there's a doubt about something technical about being a woman, I ask my wife, the wonderful novelist Catherine Noel, and she helps me out. But mostly, I just try to find an emotional connection to all the characters. I'm only interested in writing about characters who I share some deep emotional connection with. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to bring them to life. There's nothing really autobiographical in the book except for that wedding, and it's not the same wedding, but also the place and the house, right? But it's not the same place, not the same house exactly. But there's a lot of autobiographical truth in it in terms of its emotional truth. So yeah, for Cece in particular, I wanted to write about somebody who never got over the death of their mother.
Yeah.
Her mother dies when she's a teenager. As I was writing, I was first dealing with my mother's Alzheimer's and then her death and grieving my mom. And so she was in my mind a lot. And one of the things I wanted to explore in the novel was grief. And both Cece and Garrett, one of the connections they find with each other is that they're both grieving. Loved ones, or in Garrett's case, a really close friend when he was in college. So I found that, and I maybe I am less of a man inside than than I am on the outside, but I feel very, I just write about myself and the way that I'm feeling when I inhabit a female character, and people, often praise me for it. So I think that's I'm so happy that that's true.
Yeah. You spent a long time writing this book, I think 5, 6, 7 years or so. And then you had a lot more than what ultimately got published, and you had to cut it down a fair amount. I'm always interested about kind of how people cut and why people cut, but in particular with a book like this, which has such an interesting structure where it's kind of picking up with them every 10 years or so between the ages of, say, in their 20s to in their 70s. That's a generalization, but regardless, it goes over this huge time span. And it really delves into the characters and their relationships with each other, with their parents, with their children. This is not a kind of classic Aristotelian drama where one domino hits the next, right? And so I guess my question about the cutting is, on what principle do you cut? Since it's not based on an acute situation with clear causality, how do you decide what goes in and what stays out?
That's a big question, and a lot of it is trial and error. Honestly, the book went through many drafts. The first section leading up to the wedding, which is the most conventional or traditional section, was much longer, far too long. So I had to compress that a great deal. I lost whole chapters out of that. And then in the second half, I wanted to do something more original with time. And so a lot of what happens exists in the white space between chapters. And some of those chapters I wrote and decided I liked the emotional effect of the book better without them, even though I liked the individual chapters. So I'm thinking of the emotional effect of the book when I'm thinking about what to keep and what not to keep. But also I got a lot of help, a lot of readers like my wife, and I'm very lucky to have a sort of cohort of wonderful outside readers so it wasn't just taking stuff out. Sometimes it was adding things. In the second half of the book, there's a ski trip that wasn't there in the first draft, but someone wanted to know more about Charlie in particular and his relationship to his son. And so I thought, well, how do I put them on the page? And also write about skiing again, because I had so much fun writing about skiing. So it was adding stuff too.
Yeah.
as well.
Another question about craft is time, because I mean the kind of books that I write, I do like the kind of about a situation and there's a story kind of told where it's clear that one thing is causing the next in a far more direct way. I mean, there is causality in your book, of course, but it's not like this happened and then I went here and then because of that I went here and so on. But I'm just wondering about using time in a book that's so long. I mean, part of the drama of life is just that time passes. I mean, you can say like things happen. It's like now I'm 50 and before I was 40. It's like at least that happened, right? There is a kind of inherent story that just comes from the passage of time. But I'm just wondering, like, for a book that passes over 50 years, what does that allow you to do as a writer, or what kind of emotions does it allow you to get at, where someone who is writing a more discrete story that takes place over 24 hours or 3 weeks or a year, like that story can't get at what?
Yeah, it's a very different. I mean, I admire a lot of short novels, and it's a particular talent to be able to write a book that like takes place in a single day, like Seize the Day
Yeah.
by Saul Bellow or something.
Yeah.
But I've always been drawn. I mean, Alice Munro is one of my favorite writers. It's tragic, awful about her life and everything that happened there.
Oh
But
my God, what a story that
what
is.
a story. And I
Yeah.
can't defend that aspect of her, but
Yeah.
I love her. I still love her work. My God.
Mhm.
And the way that she handles time in her short stories, which feel like novels, I've always admired so much, because I think that the passage of time, writing about time, evoking the sense of the passing of time and getting it on the page,
Mhm.
is hard to do, but also has a big, big payoff.
Mhm.
In that you feel like, oh my God, I've not just read about these characters and who they are over the course of a single day, but I actually have experienced these characters' lives
Mhm.
in a way that feels much bigger to me. And it's also just partly a matter of taste, but those are the books that I've always been drawn to and that have sort of wrecked me emotionally.
Mhm.
And I don't mean wreck in a pejorative way. I just, they've really affected me in a bigger way. So yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's something you can only do if you cover a larger span of time.
All right. I want to ask one more question, and then we'll go into some of these audience questions. One question I have for you, Eric, is I like to do something called like the 3-minute MFA, where it's, like we can't go to Johns Hopkins and take your classes and be critiqued in our writing. So in lieu of that, we're going to just have you summarize everything you know in 3 minutes.
Oh my God.
No, but in all seriousness,
What if it doesn't fill 3 minutes? That would be
right, that's right. 3 minutes too long. So what about, that's funny. What would you say? Just pick like something that is like one of your best pieces of writing advice, or if it can't be summarized in like a sentence or something. What I mean more is just like something that you're always trying to emphasize most, or you hope that somebody who spent a year working with you in your class would at least come away with. What about writing?
That's, I'm going to fail this question. I know. I wish I'd thought about it beforehand. I will say this: like, someone asked me at my reading in New York,
Yeah.
and I thought this was sort of an interesting question, which was,
Yeah.
had I received writing advice as a young writer,
Mm.
which was a while ago, that I have since disavowed or thought was not all that
Mm.
helpful. And there were two, actually. The first one was that I had always been told that you were supposed to write really, really fast first drafts.
Mm.
Like, get it on the page so that you can sort of get the book on the page and see the shape
Mm.
of it. And I actually think that's quite bad advice. And
Mm.
I often tell my students, actually take more time with your first drafts. Take more time with
Mm.
your sentences, first of all, because they're the building blocks of the story or the novel that you're trying to write. And your novel and story are only as good as the sentences, right? So spend more time on the sentences, please.
Mhm.
And secondly, like when I write, it's very much like an exploratory experience. I'm trying to figure out who the characters are. And the
Yeah.
longer I spend
Yeah.
on a story or a book, the deeper those characters are and the more lifelike they are. And so
Mhm.
I always say, like, spend more time on your first drafts, not
Yeah.
less. So that's the
Yeah.
first piece of advice. The second one was that, this was sort of something that was bandied about a lot when I was a young writer in college and beyond, and when I got an MFA, which was that you were supposed to write as if everyone you knew was dead.
Yes.
Yeah, right. That's one of those little sort of adages that writing professors like to trot out. And in fact, my wife had it taped to her computer for a while, which was kind of disconcerting as her husband. But I don't like to think of her picturing me dead. But I'm not sure. I think I once subscribed to that. I don't anymore. That essay that you were talking about that I published in GQ, which was sort of a very honest look at my father from my perspective. My brother was quite unhappy about that. And I completely understand why. And I'm really sympathetic to him being unhappy about it. He had a very different experience with my father. He's 10 years older than me.
Yeah.
And I think you have to think about, like, are your words going to hurt people, and especially people that you care about. They're always going to hurt some people that you don't even know, right? There's nothing you can do about that. But you do have to think about it at least and make a decision, not just sort of blindly write as if everyone you know is dead. I don't think that's good advice.
That essay was so good. I'm wondering, knowing what you know now, having gone through it, would you have gone back and changed it after having this experience with your brother afterwards?
Honestly, I'm not sure I would have written it. I wrote about my father in a different way. In Model Home, my first novel, it's not him, but a lot of his experience. And I think I was able to find a level of sympathy for that character that is hard for me to find, harder for me to find as a son.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I would have necessarily written it. I love my brother, even though we're very different. And I really value the friendship that we have now. So yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. He forgave me and we worked it out sort of
good
male way without talking about it very much. But yeah, so.
And when I say we worked it out, I mean, I haven't talked to him since.
No.
All right, let me just take a couple questions here that we got in from the audience before we wrap. This is from Blaze founder Jenna Blum. Since you're a short story writer, do you start your novels ever as short stories?
I don't actually. In fact, I think of them as completely different beasts. And the sort of thing that everyone always says is that, short stories have more in common with poems than novels. I'm not sure if I'd go quite that far, but I know what that means. Short stories are just so different. They have to be ruthlessly economical, right? You shake a short story, like you can't even have a semicolon fall out. But if you shake a novel, you probably have whole chapters fall out. There are novels by Tolstoy I'd love to shake, like War and Peace, and get all those like philosophy on war chapters out of there. but yeah, no, I think of them so differently that I think now I'm writing a novel or I'm writing a short story. And I also very consciously try not to write a short story writer's novel. I like some of those novels, where each chapter feels like a discrete entity, its own short story. And sometimes it's just a marketing ploy. Someone has written a wonderful collection of stories, and they insist on calling it a novel in stories, right? But when I sit down to write a novel, I'm in a completely different mode, and I don't want to write that short story novel.
Yeah. All right, take one more question from the audience. Do we ever get over the death of our parents or close friends? Thank you for that question.
Well, I don't want to speak for anybody else. I don't, and I think it's very, very hard. I think you learn to live with it, and but no, and there's nothing so hard as that first year, is there? Right? I mean, that's really terrible. But yeah, no, I don't think you ever completely get over that stuff. But I don't want to speak for everybody.
Yeah. Well, Eric, this has been wonderful. Folks, the book by Eric Puchner is called Dream State. It is one of my favorite books in recent memory. It is everything they're saying it is. And believe me, they're saying a lot of good things about it. Eric, I have one last question that I ask everybody who comes on the show. And at the risk of going back against Tolstoy's warning about this question, I'm going to ask you, imagine that there is an ideal reader for Dream State, and they're just kind of getting the book in just the way that you hoped it would be gotten in your wildest dreams. And they close the book, they put it on their lap, they look out the window. Just describe in a phrase or even a word, if possible, how are they feeling?
Overwhelmed, wrecked, but changed
Mm.
in a positive way. Wrecked, but changed in a positive way.
Mm. And I know I told you to be concise, but I'm going to ask you to unpack it a little bit. How do you mean changed? Like the reader has been changed by what they thought at the beginning about these characters, or?
I mean, I read to feel more alive.
Mm.
That's one of the things that reading does for me. I get lost in a book, completely lost. And I remember actually my first reading of Anna Karenina. My friend was a river rafting guide in Moab, Utah. I picked up Anna Karenina. I had a week to kill in his trailer in the middle of the desert with nothing else to do. And I forgot that the outside world existed. And I fell into that book and I put it down, and it seemed realer than reality to me. But it also made me feel sort of uniquely alive, So if someone feels that way after reading one of my books, that's just the best thing that I could hopefully ever hear.
Oh, that's just beautiful. What I will say about this book for myself, I'm not trying to steal your thunder at the end here, but I would say it gave me different feelings than I feel like I have had before. And that is, it just, I don't know, it just felt like you were turning over stones inside me and sort of bringing things to light and exposing things within me. So, and that's definitely a form of feeling more alive, I would say.
Well, thank you very much. It means a lot.
All right, folks, this has been wonderful. Thank you. And sorry I didn't get to all the questions. I never seem to, but thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Eric, congratulations on all the success. This has been a wonderful hour, and I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate you showing up.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure, really fun.
All right, see you next time, everybody.